I think free speech is crucial, obviously, to democracy and to the freedoms that we enjoy in democracy. But it's also a very difficult concept. And what I wanted to show with the book is, first of all, that the history of free speech has very deep roots, but also that it's not exclusively a Western idea. And I think, Japan today is a good testament that free speech is not only a Western idea, but also that, so if I want to share something from RT or Sputnik, these state-sponsored Russian media outlets, I risk that YouTube or Facebook or Twitter will delete it if I'm in Europe.
はい、ピボットの竹下です。今日のピボットグローバルは、このソクラテスから SNS という本を取り上げます。著者がですね、ジェイコブ・ムシャンガマさんという、言論自由の専門家で、かなりこれ注目の本なんですね。で、アメリカは言論の自由を大事にしている国なんですけど、そのアメリカでさえ最近、ちょっと言論の自由に対する、なんていうんですか、悲観論が広がっていまして、というのも SNS でいろいろフェイクニュース、ディスインフォメーションとか、あるいは誹謗中傷とか、あるいは AI によるボットが出てきていて、言論の自由ばっかり認めてもいけないんじゃないかみたいな議論が結構アメリカに出てます。で、そんなアメリカでも、いや、それでもやっぱり言論の自由は大事だよっていうことを、このソクラテスの歴史から、しかも西洋だけじゃなくてですね、東洋とか、世界中の言論の歴史を紐解きながら、それでもなお言論自由っていうのは大事だよっていうことを主張している人です。私もちょっとそこには懐疑的なところがあるので、ちょっと本人に聞いてですね、なぜそこまで強く主張しているのかっていうことを聞いてみたいと思います。では早速、ジェイコブさんにつないでみたいと思います。Okay, let's begin. So, Jacob, welcome to Pivot.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to do this interview with you today.
Thanks for joining. So we have your Japanese version of your book. It says Socrates to SNS. SNS, social media in Japan. So you wrote about free speech. I read it both in Japanese and English. I thought it was very great. So I want to kick off by asking you why the free speech is important. Because everyone says free speech is important, but it's always a yes, but answer. It's important, but there's always hate speech, disinformation, online harassment. Could you elaborate on that? Why did you decide to write a book about free speech, and why do you think it's important?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to apologize to any Japanese readers that I didn't really include much on the history of Japan. Maybe in the next edition, I will look more into your interesting history and the importance of free speech in Japan. So
yes,
apologies for my ignorance. But I think free speech is crucial, obviously, to democracy and to the freedoms that we enjoy in democracy. But it's also a very difficult concept. And what I wanted to show with the book is, first of all, that the history of free speech has very deep roots, but also that it's not exclusively a Western idea. And I think, Japan today is a good testament that free speech is not only a Western idea, but also that, throughout history, there have always been, those who were in favor of free speech, but then they had second thoughts, and then they thought that there was too much free speech, and then they wanted to shut down free speech when new technology comes along. For instance, the printing press is a good example. And I think we're living at a time of what I call elite panic, at a time where, because of social media, because of generative AI, a lot of people who are the traditional gatekeepers are now wanting to shut down free speech, or to limit free speech that they themselves enjoy, but don't want everyone to be able.
So in your book, you talked about the elite panic. And so historically speaking, I kind of understand that why people in power hate free speech, but they'll kind of challenge their authority. But what we're seeing today, especially in social media, do you think it's similar or it's different? Because to me, it seems quite different from the historical circumstance of free speech.
You mean the concept of social media is very different to previous technologies of free speech, or do you mean the?
Yes, yeah. Right.
I think there are similarities in the sense that, so if you go back to the printing press, suddenly you were able to produce pamphlets and books and manuscripts at a speed and a volume that was unprecedented. And you have a bit the same today. So even, before social media, before the internet, in theory, everyone had free speech, but you were still dependent on editors, journalists, to give you a voice. Because if you were a citizen in Tokyo and you wanted to say something before the age of social media, you could stand on the streets of Tokyo, but very few people would hear you unless a journalist was interviewing you or an editor accepted your letter in a newspaper. But now you're a startup media. It would have been probably very difficult for you to reach an impressive audience of 1.5 million young people in the age of before the internet. So certainly new voices are given access to speak and speak freely. And it's not just an elite of established gatekeepers. So I think there are similarities. Obviously, there are also big differences because the scale is just so much higher than with the printing press. But I think there are important similarities.
So what do you think about the positive side and negative side of free speech?
Yeah. So I think overwhelmingly, if we look at the history of free speech, the positive sides outweigh the negative ones. You cannot point to a single functioning democracy where basic human rights are respected without free speech. In fact, the whole idea of a democracy becomes meaningless without free speech. And I think, unfortunately, in many countries that are sort of old democracies, if you like, they tend to take free speech for granted. They tend to not think, free speech is a bit like breathing the air. Like it's normal for you to be able to criticize a politician or, to speak your mind on whatever you think. But you don't have to travel very far before you get to countries where you can't do that. So I mean, you're in Asia, so if you are living in mainland China or you're living in Taiwan, that's a bit. What's the main difference? Arguably, the main difference between mainland China and Taiwan is free speech. And I like that in Taiwan. Because it's only sort of in the mid-late 80s that they became a democracy, they're very supportive of free speech. They remember what it was like to live under dictatorship when you could go to prison or even be killed, and they can see just across the Taiwan Strait what's going on, and that censorship is the norm in mainland China. And in Europe, you can be in Denmark, where I'm from. But if you travel to Belarus, suddenly you face censorship. But most people in Denmark don't think of free speech on a daily basis. They just take it for granted because they were born with it, and they're not afraid of taking it away. And then in the age of social media, I think the dark sides, the bad sides of free speech are much more visible. So we tend to focus on them, that people say ugly things or there's disinformation spreading. So we take the benefits for granted, but we focus a lot on the bad sides, and that gives an impulse to want to restrict free speech.
Do you think we are overreacting? If we see like a fake news on Facebook or Twitter, we say, "Oh, that's a problem. It's a threat to democracy. We should restrict social media." Do you think we are overreacting?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a tendency to overreact. That's not to say that free speech or disinformation cannot have negative consequences. It can. But first of all, disinformation is not a new thing. It's a very old phenomenon that has always been employed. And I think there's a tendency also to overestimate how gullible people are, and also to overestimate the reach and persuasiveness of disinformation online. And so, and I think there's also a danger that when democracies restrict free speech in the name of fighting disinformation, you pave the way for authoritarian states to free. And I think we've seen that. So, after COVID-19, a lot of states passed laws against disinformation, and they use them not only to fight, medical misinformation or disinformation, but also to put journalists and others in prison who were critical of the government. So that's also a danger. And I think free speech gives you opportunity to fight against the dark sides of free speech, and I think that should be the main weapon in the arsenal of those who are in favor of democracy.
I totally agree with you, but however, I would like to go back to the point I made about how social media is different from the technology, such as the printing press. Because like you mentioned, I agree, there was disinformation, misinformation, malinformation during the historical times, but it was at least it was a human being doing that. But in the age of social media, it's bots, AI, and maybe China or Russia. So it's the state actors participating in the public sphere. So could you argue that at least you can restrict actors that are not like not normal, but like ordinary citizens?
Well, I would say that states have been very active disseminators of disinformation even before social media. So there was the KGB was arguably the pioneer of disinformation. Had a special unit in the KGB with an Armenian called Ivan Argayans who pioneered these efforts. And so, for instance, they would paint swastikas on synagogues in Germany, and newspapers would write about it being neo-Nazis, but in reality it was the Soviet Union, it was the KGB. And they would also be able to put stories in Western media that were based on lies or propaganda and misinformation. So I don't think that state-sponsored disinformation is something new with social media. Of course, you could say that with social media they have opportunities to maybe reach a broader audience. But I don't think. I think when it comes to sort of state-sponsored disinformation, it is depending on where you are in the world. I'm not an expert on Japanese affairs at all, but I would imagine, since Japan is a country with a well-educated population, if North Korea was to do state-sponsored disinformation in Japan, it's not like most people in Japan would say, "Hey, let's all become communists and support North Korea and their ambitions." And it's the same, I think, in many places in Europe. Russian state-sponsored disinformation is not so much about convincing Europeans in Western democracies about the merits of Putin or the Russian authoritarianism. It's more about creating this sense that Russia has these abilities to create chaos and act behind the scenes, and maybe sow distrust in democracies. That's probably the most damaging and most dangerous effect of it. But it's certainly not a new phenomenon.
So you're saying that if there is a freedom of speech, there's a way to fight back against disinformation, or
Yeah, I don't think you can ever get rid of it. But I think, again, I think Taiwan is a very inspiring case. So, there was just a presidential election, as I'm sure you're aware of. And I think Taiwan is a country that does a lot, that uses civil society organizations, that uses sort of the pioneers of the Sunflower Revolution, who sort of to use innovative, tech-oriented civil society methods to fight disinformation, sort of crowdsourcing disinformation attempts through civil society, rather than the government trying to use censorship. And when the government has tried to use censorship, there was a law that was almost passed, but Taiwanese civil society pushed back against it. So I think Taiwan is a good case of a country that faces very serious state-sponsored disinformation from China, probably the most orchestrated disinformation campaign any country is facing in the world, because of China's huge interest in affecting affairs in Taiwan. But I think Taiwan is an inspiration. I think actually to me, Taiwan is an inspiration compared to the European Union, which has banned state-sponsored Russian outlets, and also sharing the messages of state-sponsored Russian media outlets on social media. So if I want to share something from RT or Sputnik, these state-sponsored Russian media outlets, I risk that YouTube or Facebook or Twitter will delete it if I'm in Europe. I think that's, it's not only censorship of, media outlets, but it's also interfering with the right to access to information, which I think is very important. I want to know what the Russians are saying, what they're saying. Mm-hmm. I want to know what their propaganda points is, because that gives me a better opportunity of understanding where they're coming from.
Yeah, you're right. So even if we want to read or watch RT in a very critical way, that will restrict us from doing so.
Yeah, and why should it be up to the European Union to determine what kind of information the citizens in 27 democracies can access? And I think anyone who wants to for instance follow the war in Ukraine will have to also go to Russian sources, even if they're propagandists who are who are spread disinformation, or who maybe even spread propaganda, war propaganda. It's a source to try and understand what's going on. There's also the problem that if you shut down channels on social media, you hinder efforts at debunking disinformation, and also to uncover war crimes, and where you need to rely on social media feeds, Telegram channels, for instance, from Russia. So I think all in all, it's a bad idea. And of course, Russia uses it to justify its own restrictions of Western media within Russia. And I think, RT and Sputnik they have very little success in persuading a Western audience, but I think it's very important for BBC to be able to operate in Russia, because it's actually a method of getting reliable information and different perspectives than Russian state-sponsored propaganda within Russia. So I think it's a small price to pay to suffer some Russian propaganda in open democracies, for having them operate in an authoritarian state.
Do you think that we should use our resources to not just to restrict, such as the RT or Sputnik, but more train journalists or fact checkers or professionals? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is already going on. Every university and think tank has a program on disinformation. So, and lots of people are researching it. And of course, I think, and again, if you look at China, you can really see how AI is being used to conduct, high-tech surveillance and censorship that at a scale that has never been achieved in human history before. And that, I think, is very scary. Should these chatbots be seen as sort of general purpose technologies, the way that you would think of, word processing software or an email client? Or do we need to have restrictions on them